Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me where in the world are you watching this from. Whether you're in Texas, Florida, California, or somewhere across the ocean, let me know. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. We post new videos every week, and trust me, you do not want to miss what's coming next. Now, let me ask you something. Have you ever worked somewhere for so long that the place felt like a second home, where you knew every corner, every quirk, every crack in the ceiling, where you gave your best years, your energy, your loyalty, your absolute everything, because you believed in what you were building, and then one day, without warning, without gratitude, without a single ounce of respect, they told you it was over. Not because you failed, not because you made mistakes, but simply because you were older. If that hits close to home, if you've ever felt invisible, discarded, replaced by someone younger who didn't know half of what you know, then this story is for you. Because today we're telling the story of Carolyn Hayes, a woman who gave 35 years of her life to a company, a woman who was pushed out the door with a forced smile and a grocery store cake, a woman they called too old, too slow, a relic of the past. What they didn't know, what they never bothered to find out, was that Carolyn Hayes had been quietly, patiently, strategically preparing for exactly this moment. They thought they were ending her career. They were actually handing her the throne. This is her story. The alarm went off at 5:47 in the morning, same as always. Carolyn Hayes didn't need it, really. After 35 years of early mornings, her body had long since learned to wake itself up before the sun had any say in the matter. She lay still for just a moment, staring at the pale gray light filtering through the curtains of her bedroom. The same curtains she'd had for 12 years, the same pale yellow that her late husband Raymond had picked out because he said the color reminded him of spring, even in November. She smiled at the memory as she always did. Then she sat up, swung her legs over the side of the bed, and began her day. Carolyn's morning routine was something close to art. 40 minutes, start to finish. Coffee, first. Real coffee, not the pod machine kind, but the kind you brewed in a stovetop percolator, the way her mother had taught her. Then a bowl of oatmeal with blueberries and a spoonful of honey. Then 20 minutes with the newspaper, the actual physical newspaper, not the app, because she believed there was something important about holding the day's information in your hands before you went out to face it. By 6:45, she was dressed. Navy blazer, gray slacks, low-heeled shoes that were sensible but polished. She checked herself in the mirror by the front door hair, neatly pinned reading glasses on their chain around her neck. Small gold earrings that Raymond had given her for their 20th anniversary, and nodded once as if giving herself approval to proceed. She drove the same route she had driven for over 3 decades. Down Maple left, on Briar right on Commerce, and then the long, straight stretch of Industrial Boulevard that led to the Hartwell Logistics campus, a collection of low-grade buildings and loading docks that most people drove past without a second glance, but which Carolyn had watched grow from a single warehouse into one of the Mid-Atlantic region's most significant freight coordination operations. She had been there for all of it. She had helped build all of it. Carolyn pulled into her usual parking spot, not an assigned one, just the spot she had always taken. The one in the third row that was close enough to the entrance to be convenient, but not so close that it looked like she was pulling rank. She sat in the car for a moment before getting out the engine, ticking quietly as it cooled, and looked at the building in front of her. Something felt different this morning. She couldn't have said what exactly. The building looked the same. The loading dock crews were already moving, same as always. The light above the main entrance buzzed with the same faint electrical hum it had buzzed with for the past decade, despite the 3 maintenance requests she had filed to have it fixed. But something in the air felt different. She brushed the feeling aside and went inside. The operations floor of Hartwell Logistics was, to anyone who didn't know it, a wall of controlled chaos. Screens everywhere, phones ringing, freight coordinators shouting tracking numbers across rows of desks, the low hum of servers in the back room mixing with the rumble of trucks outside. To Carolyn, it was music. She knew this floor the way a conductor knows an orchestra. She knew which desk had the temperamental monitor that needed to be tapped twice on the left side to stabilize the display. She knew which phone line was routed through the outdated switchboard that sometimes dropped calls to the Portland depot, a quirk that had been in the system for 4 years and that nobody had bothered to fix because nobody else had ever taken the time to trace it. She knew that the new tracking software, the one the company had paid $140,000 for 18 months ago, had a critical flaw in its routing algorithm that caused it to misassign freight priorities during multi-depot transfers. And she had been the one to catch it, document it, and develop the workaround that the entire operations team now used without realizing it had been her doing. She knew all of this. She had always known all of this. That was the thing about Carolyn Hayes. She paid attention. Not because someone told her to, not because it was in her job description, but because she genuinely cared about the work. She cared about the company getting it right. She cared about the drivers having accurate manifests. She cared about the clients, the small manufacturers and regional retailers who depended on Hartwell to get their products where they needed to be on time every time. She had always cared. It had never occurred to her not to. She sat down at her desk and opened her computer. Before she had even finished typing her password, a call came in from the Cincinnati hub. A scheduling conflict with a Tuesday delivery run. 3 drivers, 2 loads, 1 dock a time, overlap that nobody had noticed until the shift supervisor called in a panic at 6:50 in the morning. Carolyn, the voice on the other end was young and stressed. I'm sorry to call so early, but I didn't know who else. It's all right, Marcus, she said. Let me pull up the manifest. She had it resolved in 11 minutes. Rerouted 1 driver through the Cleveland distribution point, adjusted the dock window by 45 minutes, and sent the revised schedule to all 3 drivers before Marcus had finished thanking her. She hung up and reached for her coffee. Across the floor, she could see the glass-walled office that had belonged until 8 months ago to Gerald Harmon, the man who had hired Carolyn back when she was 29 years old and had been the company's CEO for most of her career. Gerald had been demanding and particular and occasionally infuriating, but he had been fundamentally decent, and he had understood the way good leaders understand that the people who made an organization actually work were not always the ones with the corner offices. Gerald had retired 14 months ago, voluntarily at 71 with grace and genuine warmth, and with a party that had gone until midnight and involved dancing. The office now belonged to Mark Reynolds. Carolyn watched him through the glass. He was already on the phone, already gesturing with the sharp, decisive movements that she had come to associate with men who confused confidence with competence. He was 45 years old and had come to Hartwell from a management consulting firm with a resume full of impressive-sounding restructuring projects and a philosophy that could be summarized as far as Carolyn could tell in 3 words out with old. She had tried in the first few months after his arrival to build a working relationship with him. She had prepared detailed briefings on the operations systems, the key client relationships, the recurring challenges she had developed solutions for. She had requested meetings and been rescheduled. She had sent follow-up emails and received brief, generic replies. She had offered to walk him through the Cincinnati hub integration personally and been told politely but firmly that Mark had already spoken with the technology team and had the situation well in hand. The situation had not been well in hand. The Cincinnati integration had stumbled badly in its first quarter for exactly the reasons she had flagged, and it had been quietly corrected by her team without any acknowledgement that it had ever been a problem. She had stopped trying after that. The morning passed, the way most mornings passed for Carolyn, steadily, productively punctuated by the small crises and solutions that formed the rhythm of operations management. She reviewed 2 contracts. She walked the floor twice. She spent 40 minutes with a new hire named Daniel, who was struggling with the routing interface, and left him, she thought, with at least a fighting chance of getting through his first week without a major error. At 11:15, she received an email from Jenna Cole. Carolyn. Do you have a few minutes this afternoon? I'd like to chat. 2 p.m. work. Jenna Cole was the Director of Human Resources. She was 38 precise and had the particular brand of warmth that experienced professionals learn to recognize as its own kind of cold, the smile that stays exactly the same width regardless of the content of the conversation. Carolyn had known women like Jenna before. She respected their efficiency while remaining clear-eyed about their methods. Sure, she replied. I'll come by your office. She went back to work and did not think about it further. That was also part of who Carolyn Hayes was. She did not borrow trouble. She dealt with what was in front of her. At 2 o'clock, she walked to HR. Jenna's office was on the 2nd floor, tucked into the corner of the administrative wing, and it had been redecorated since Jenna's arrival to reflect a carefully curated aesthetic of calm professionalism, Gray walls, white shelving, a single large print of geometric shapes in muted tones. The kind of room designed to feel neutral. The kind of room where people were told things they didn't want to hear and the surroundings offered no emotional handholds. Carolyn recognized this the moment she walked in. She also recognized with a small quiet certainty that settled somewhere in her chest that Mark Reynolds was sitting in the chair to the left of Jenna's desk. She had not been told he would be there. She sat down. Jenna opened with the preliminary pleasantries. "How are you settling into the week? Hope the morning wasn't too hectic." And then she folded her hands on the desk in the way that people fold their hands when they have rehearsed what comes next. "Carolyn," she said, "we've been doing a lot of thinking about the direction of the company, about where we want to go in the next 5 years, about the kind of team we need to get there." "I see," Carolyn said. "We think it's time for you to retire." The words sat in the room. Carolyn looked at Jenna, then at Mark. Mark was looking at a point slightly to the left of her face, the posture of a man who wanted to appear engaged, but had already mentally moved on to the next agenda item. "I wasn't planning to," Carolyn said. "The company is moving forward," Mark said, cutting in. His voice had the practiced cadence of someone who had delivered this kind of conversation before and had long since stopped feeling anything about it. "We're making significant changes to the operation structure. We're integrating new systems, new methodologies. We need a team that's positioned to grow with those changes." "I've been integrating new systems and methodologies for 35 years, Carolyn said. "Of course," Jenna said smoothly, "and your contributions have been invaluable, truly. But we feel that this is a natural transition point. We want to honor the work you've done here. We're thinking a proper send-off, a retirement package that reflects your tenure." "What's the timeline?" Carolyn asked. There was a brief pause. "We'd like to begin the transition by the end of the month," Mark said. "The end of the month, 18 days. Carolyn looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in her very quietly. Not anger, not yet, but something beneath anger, something older and more solid. The thing you feel when you have been underestimated so comprehensively that the realization itself becomes a kind of clarity. "All right," she said. "I'll need that in writing." She stood, smoothed her blazer, and walked out of the room. The retirement party was Jenna's idea, of course. It was held on a Friday afternoon in the third-floor conference room with store-bought cake and a banner that read, "Happy Retirement, Carolyn," in cheerful red letters, and a card that had been circulated around the office that morning and was now covered in the signatures of people who had been told to sign it without being given any context beyond Carolyn is retiring. She stood by the window and accepted a paper plate with a slice of cake she had no intention of eating, and she smiled at the people who came to say the things people say at these events. "You deserve the rest. You've worked so hard. What are you going to do with all that free time?" She said the right things back. She had spent enough years managing human dynamics to know how to navigate a room like this on autopilot. Then Mark spoke. He stood at the front of the room with a glass of sparkling cider and the expression of a man performing generosity. "We want to take a moment," he said, "to acknowledge Carolyn's many years of service to this company. She's been a fixture here, a real part of the Hartwell story. And while change is never easy, we believe this transition represents exactly the kind of fresh energy and new direction that's going to take this company into its next chapter." So to Carolyn, we appreciate her service, and we wish her the very best in her well-deserved retirement. We appreciate her service. The room applauded. Carolyn held her plate and looked at the banner and thought about 35 years. She thought about the night she had stayed until 8, 9, 10 o'clock because a system failure needed to be traced and resolved before the morning run. She thought about the clients she had personally called during the pandemic, when the supply chain was fracturing and people needed to hear a calm, competent voice on the other end of the line. She thought about the people she had trained. The problem she had solved, the institutional knowledge she carried in her head that had no home in any manual or database or software system because nobody had ever thought to write it down. Fresh energy. Across the room, Kevin Marsh was laughing at something one of the younger operations staff had said. Kevin was 30 years old and had been at the company for 14 months. He had been hired by Mark, promoted twice in less than a year, and assigned to take over Carolyn's operational responsibilities, a decision that had been communicated to the floor she had learned through the grapevine before it had been communicated to her. Kevin caught her looking and raised his cider in a small toast. "Big shoes to fill," and he said with the smile of someone who did not actually believe the shoes were particularly large. "I'll try to keep up, but no promises." Laughter. Polite warmed the laughter of a room happy to move on. Carolyn smiled back. It was a very specific kind of smile, the kind that lives entirely in the lower half of the face and does not reach the eyes at all. She set down her plate. She said a few more goodbyes. She collected her things from her desk, the framed photo of Raymond, the small cactus she'd kept on the windowsill for 11 years, the well-worn copy of a logistics management text she kept for reference, and she walked out of the building for the last time as an employee of Hartwell Logistics. In the parking lot, she paused. Her phone buzzed. An email notification, something from a financial institution. She worked with a subject line she didn't immediately process. She glanced at it and slid the phone back into her pocket. She'd look at it later. She got in her car. She sat for a moment in the quiet. Then she started the engine and drove home. She didn't open the email until that evening. She was sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea. The house very quiet around her, the kind of quiet that happens at the end of a day that has changed more than it appeared to. She opened her laptop, found the email in her inbox, and read it. It was a quarterly portfolio summary. Routine. The kind of document she had been receiving in various forms for the better part of 20 years since the period shortly after Raymond's death, when she had sat down with a financial advisor friend and made a series of decisions that she had revisited and refined and quietly continued ever since. She read through the numbers slowly, the way she read everything carefully without rushing. And then she put down her tea, because the numbers on the screen, the accumulated result of 20 years of disciplined, anonymous, unremarked upon investment decisions, told her something that Mark Reynolds did not know, that Jenna Cole did not know, that no one at that retirement party with their paper plates and their store-bought cake and their fresh energy had any idea about. Carolyn Hayes was not simply a former employee of Hartwell Logistics. She was one of its largest shareholders. She sat in the quiet kitchen for a long time looking at the screen. Outside, the neighborhood was settling into evening. A dog barked down the street. A car passed. Slowly, deliberately, Carolyn reached up and removed her reading glasses from their chain. She polished them on the hem of her blazer. She put them back on. She picked up her tea. And for the first time since Jenna Cole had folded her hands on that desk and said, "We think it's time for you to retire," Carolyn Hayes allowed herself a genuine smile. Not the polite one, not the one that lived in the lower half of the face, the real one. She had a great deal to think about. The weekend passed quietly. Carolyn did not call anyone. She did not post anything on social media. She had never been particularly active there anyway. She did not drive past the Hartwell building. She went to the farmer's market on Saturday morning, bought tomatoes and a bunch of sunflowers, came home, cleaned the kitchen, and spent Saturday evening reading a novel she had been meaning to get to for 3 months. Anyone watching would have thought she was taking retirement exactly as it was presented to her, gracefully, gently, with the dignified acceptance of a woman who had done her time and was now ready to rest. Inside, she was doing something else entirely. She was thinking. Carolyn had always been a careful thinker, not slow but thorough. She disliked acting on partial information. She disliked reacting before she understood the full shape of a situation. This had sometimes frustrated people around her who wanted decisions faster than she was willing to make them, but it had also, over the course of a 35-year career, meant that she was very rarely wrong when she finally did act. She was thinking about the portfolio summary. She was thinking about what she actually owned, not just in the general sense of a significant investment, but in the precise legal voting rights sense. She was thinking about what that meant. She was thinking about the questions it raised. And she was thinking about something else, a conversation she had overheard about 6 weeks before her forced retirement while walking past the small conference room on the second floor. The door had been slightly ajar. She had not intended to listen. She had heard in the space of about 10 seconds the words, "acquisition offer below valuation," and Mark's voice saying, "We can manage the shareholder response." She had filed it away. She hadn't known at the time exactly why it bothered her. Now she was starting to understand. On Monday morning, she made a phone call. The offices of Greenbrier Investment Advisors occupied the ninth floor of a downtown building that smelled of carpet cleaner and was perpetually slightly too cold. Carolyn had been coming here for 19 years since the month after Raymond's funeral, when her friend Patricia, who had spent her career in finance, had sat with her at this same table and helped her figure out what to do with the life insurance payout and the small inheritance and the question of what came next. The man sitting across from her now was not Patricia, who had retired 2 years ago to coastal Maine, but a younger colleague named David Reeves, whom Carolyn had transitioned her account to at Patricia's recommendation and had grown to trust in the methodical way she trusted anyone over time through demonstrated competence by watching how they handled situations that required honesty rather than comfort. She put the portfolio summary on the table between them. "Walk me through where we are," she said. "Specifically, the Hartwell position." David opened his laptop and pulled up the account. He walked her through it with the care of someone who understood that numbers were not abstract to the people whose lives they represented. The Hartwell position built over nearly 20 years through a combination of direct share purchases, reinvested dividends, and 2 specific acquisition opportunities that Carolyn had recognized and acted on with unusual precision was substantial. More than substantial. "You hold 9.4% of total outstanding shares," he said, "through the Ridgway Fund." "Through Ridgway, yes. The fund holds the shares and you are the beneficial owner. There's no public filing that connects your name to the position you've stayed below the reporting threshold through the structure." "And the voting rights?" "Full voting rights," he said, "all attached to the shares, which means I have a vote at any shareholder meeting," she said. "Yes, and depending on the distribution of the remaining shares," he pulled up another document. "The Founding Family Trust holds about 21%. Meridian Capital holds about 14%. The rest is broadly distributed. You at 9.4% are effectively the third largest single interest holder." Carolyn was quiet for a moment. She was doing math in her head, the kind of math she had always been good at, the kind that involved not just numbers, but people and motivations, and the question of what everyone in a room actually wanted. "What would I need to call a shareholder meeting?" she asked. David looked at her steadily. He had known her long enough to recognize when she was asking a practical question as opposed to a hypothetical one. "You'd need to hold at least 10% of voting shares or have the cooperation of other holders to reach that threshold. You're at 9.4%. "I know someone who holds 1.2%, she said. A pause. "Then you'd be at 10.6%, enough to formally call a special meeting under the company's articles of incorporation." She nodded, and if there were evidence of management making decisions that materially disadvantaged shareholders, undervaluing the company for a potential sale, for instance, what would that look like legally? David leaned forward. "That's a conversation for a securities attorney, but the short answer is it would be very serious, breach of fiduciary duty potentially, depending on the evidence. I'll need a referral," she said, "for a good one." He wrote a name and number on a card and slid it across the table. She picked it up, looked at it, and put it in her pocket. "Thank you, David," she said. She drove home and called the number. But the retirement party's afterlife, as these things tend to lasted longer than the party itself. Carolyn heard from former colleagues, the ones she was actually close to, not the ones who had signed the card without knowing why in the days that followed. Careful messages, the kind people send when they want to say something but aren't sure it's safe to say it directly. "Hope you're doing okay." It was pretty sudden, wasn't it? And from Marcus in Cincinnati, who had always been direct. That whole thing felt wrong, Carolyn. For what it's worth, she appreciated the messages. She replied warmly to each one. She did not tell any of them what she was thinking, but she was listening, and in listening, she began to gather a picture of what had been happening at Hartwell since Mark Reynolds had arrived. The technology restructuring that had been announced with great fanfare, the one that was supposed to modernize the operations infrastructure, had gone significantly over budget and was now running 8 months behind schedule. 3 of the company's longest-standing regional clients had not renewed their contracts, a fact that the executive team had not disclosed to the board. There had been 2 significant freight routing failures in the past quarter, both of which had required expensive remediation and had damaged relationships with carriers that Carolyn had spent years cultivating. And the sale. She was learning more about the sale. A regional competitor, Prescott Freight Solutions, had made an approach in the spring. an acquisition offer. The numbers Carolyn was able to piece together through a combination of conversations with her attorney, a careful reading of filings and public records, and a frank phone call with a former board member she had known for 20 years suggested that the offer significantly undervalued Hartwell. Not accidentally undervalued, deliberately. Structured in a way that benefited certain interests and disadvantaged others. Structured in a way that would make sense if you were the CEO who had negotiated a lucrative post-acquisition employment agreement for yourself. There was also, her attorney pointed out, after 2 weeks of careful research, a question about whether Mark's employment contract with Prescott, signed apparently in the same month as the acquisition discussions began, had been disclosed to the board. It had not been disclosed to the board. Carolyn sat in her kitchen with all of this in front of her and felt the shape of the situation with the same methodical clarity she had used her whole career. Find the problem. Understand it. Fully. Determine the solution. Execute. She picked up the phone and called Eleanor Marsh. Eleanor was 73 years old and had inherited through her late father a 1.2% stake in Hartwell Logistics that she had always treated as a minor curiosity in her investment portfolio rather than anything of real consequence. She and Carolyn had known each other for 15 years through various professional circles. Eleanor was sharp-principled and had a deep personal dislike of being taken advantage of. "Eleanor," Carolyn said, "I need to talk to you about Hartwell." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I've been wondering," Eleanor said slowly, "when someone was going to call me about that." Back at the office she no longer had any reason to visit, except that she did once in the second week after her retirement. The chaos that she had predicted was quietly unfolding. Kevin Marsh. No relation to Eleanor, had taken over her operational responsibilities with the confidence of a man who had been told he was the right person for the job and had chosen to believe it without much examination. He was not without ability. He was organized in a surface-level way, energetic, good at performing competence in meetings. What he lacked was the depth of knowledge that only time produces, the understanding of why things worked the way they did, the recognition of the patterns that preceded problems, the institutional memory that allowed you to solve crises in 11 minutes, rather than calling them in as emergencies. The first significant incident came 9 days after Carolyn's retirement. A multi-depot transfer failure, a cascade of misassigned freight priorities in the routing system, exactly the kind of error that Carolyn's workaround had been preventing for 2 years. Without the workaround, which Kevin did not know existed because nobody had thought to document it, because it had lived entirely in Carolyn's head and her quiet habits, the error propagated through the Tuesday morning run and resulted in 3 misdirected loads, 2 missed delivery windows, and 1 very unhappy client. Mark called an all-hands meeting that afternoon. She heard about it from a former colleague who texted her afterward. He said it was a legacy systems problem, said it was an example of why the old way of doing things had to change. Basically blamed the whole thing on the previous team. She read the text, she set the phone down, she went back to work. The attorney's name was Sandra Kwan. She had spent 22 years in corporate securities law, the last 12 of them running her own firm, and she had the particular demeanor of someone who had seen enough of human nature in a professional context to have very few illusions left about it, while somehow remaining fundamentally engaged by the challenge of making things right. Carolyn liked her immediately. They met for the first time in Sandra's conference room on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the retirement party. Carolyn arrived with a folder of documents organized chronologically, indexed, flagged with small, color-coded tabs that she set on the table between them. Sandra looked at the folder. Then she looked at Carolyn. "You've done this before," she said. "I've done everything before," Carolyn said. "I've been working since I was 24 years old." Sandra opened the folder. The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours. By the end of it, they had established several things with clarity. First, Carolyn's shareholding position, combined with Eleanor Marsh's 1.2%, gave her the formal standing to call a special meeting of shareholders. This was not a theoretical option. It was a right written into the company's articles of incorporation that no amount of executive authority could override. Second, the conduct of Mark Reynolds in relation to the Prescott acquisition, specifically the undisclosed employment agreement and the potential deliberate undervaluation of the company, represented in Sandra's professional judgment a serious and potentially actionable breach of fiduciary duty. Third, the question of how to proceed was strategic as much as legal. A lawsuit was one option. A formal complaint to the board was another. But the most direct and the most effective, the one that addressed the situation at its source in the room where the decisions were actually made, was the shareholder meeting. If you can demonstrate to a majority of voting shareholders that the Prescott deal damages their interests, Sandra said, the deal doesn't happen. And if you can simultaneously present evidence of the undisclosed employment agreement, Mark loses the board's confidence, Carolyn said. Assuming the board has any integrity left, yes. Carolyn nodded slowly. What do I need? Evidence. Documented, clean, presentable to non-experts. The kind of case that doesn't require people to be lawyers to understand it. I know this company's financials better than most of the people who are paid to know them, Carolyn said. I've been watching them for 20 years. Then start building the case, Sandra said. I'll handle the legal framework. They shook hands. Carolyn walked out of the building and stood on the sidewalk for a moment looking at the street. The city moved around her taxis and pedestrians and the ordinary mechanical pulse of a working Tuesday morning. She thought about the last 35 years. She thought about every meeting where her input had been dismissed, every proposal she'd submitted that had been quietly shelved, every moment she had chosen patience over confrontation because she trusted that the institution would ultimately correct itself. She had been patient for a very long time. She was done being patient. I didn't lose my job, she thought. I just changed my position. She walked to her car and drove home to work. The research took 3 weeks. It was in a fundamental way exactly the kind of work Carolyn had always done, systematic, detailed, grounded in primary sources. She pulled financial records. She reviewed the annual reports going back 5 years. She obtained through Sandra's office and through the legal process of discovery available to a significant shareholder copies of board minutes and executive compensation disclosures. What she found was by itself significant. The Prescott offer, $47 per share, was premised on a financial analysis that undervalued Hartwell's core assets by approximately 23%, according to an independent valuation commissioned through Sandra's firm. This undervaluation was not accidental. It was specifically traceable to the treatment of Hartwell's long-term client contracts, the ones Carolyn herself had negotiated and maintained as expiring liabilities rather than durable assets. The distinction was not a matter of legitimate accounting interpretation. It was a choice that benefited Prescott's acquisition price by approximately $40 million, and that coincidentally benefited Mark Reynolds's post-acquisition compensation arrangement by several million more. The undisclosed employment agreement was real. Sandra had obtained a copy through a source Carolyn did not ask about. It was dated March 15th. The first formal acquisition discussions between Hartwell and Prescott were dated March 3rd. Mark had signed an agreement to be paid by the acquiring company 12 days after those discussions began, and he had not disclosed it to the board or to shareholders for 7 months. Carolyn read all of this very carefully several times in the quiet of her kitchen. She made notes. She organized everything into a presentation, not a legal document, but the kind of clear, logical, evidence-based analysis she had prepared for operations reviews her entire career. Numbers, sources, implications, conclusions. She sent it to Sandra for review. While she waited for Sandra's response, she called the other shareholders. There were, in addition to herself, Eleanor, the Founding Family Trust, and Meridian Capital, approximately 40 individuals and small entities that held between 0.3% and 2.1% of Hartwell's shares. Carolyn did not know all of them personally, but she knew several, and the ones she didn't know she researched carefully before calling. The conversations followed a pattern. She introduced herself. She explained that she was a significant shareholder and a former senior operations executive. She said she had information about the proposed Prescott acquisition that she believed all shareholders needed to hear before the transaction proceeded. She asked for 30 minutes. Most of them gave her the 30 minutes. The ones who gave her 30 minutes generally stayed for an hour. She was not angry in these conversations. She was not dramatic. She was factual, organized, and specific. Here is the evidence, here is what it means, here is what I believe the correct course of action is. She addressed objections as they came up. She acknowledged the aspects of the acquisition that were, on the surface, attractive. She explained patiently why the surface was misleading. By the end of the 3 weeks, she had spoken with shareholders representing just over 38% of total voting shares. She had not asked any of them for a commitment. She had only asked them to come to the meeting, to come and listen, and to make their own judgment based on the information she would present. She believed on the basis of those conversations that they would. There was in all of this one more thing she needed to do. It was smaller than the legal work, smaller than the research, but in some ways it was the most important. Because the shareholder meeting would be about numbers and evidence and legal frameworks, but it would also be about the company itself, about what Hartwell actually was, what it was worth, what could be preserved if the right decisions were made. And for that, she needed to know what had happened to it in her absence. She called Marcus in Cincinnati. "How bad is it?" she asked. A long pause. "It's not good, Carolyn. The routing errors they've had, 3 more since you left. The new tracking system they paid for, the one Mark keeps presenting in meetings as the future of the company. It's failing on multi-depot transfers at a rate of about 1 in 8. Nobody's talking about it publicly, but we know. The drivers know. The clients are starting to know." "What about the Portland account?" "Well, they gave notice last month, renewing with Cascade Freight. They didn't say why officially, but the regional contact told me off the record it was the service quality issues." Portland. A client she had onboarded personally 13 years ago. A relationship she had maintained through a freight rate dispute, a contract renegotiation, a major shipping delay during a winter storm and a global pandemic. Gone in 30 days. "Thank you, Marcus," she said. "Carolyn, can I ask what you're doing?" She thought about how to answer. "Making sure the right people have the right information," she said. "Is there anything I can do?" She considered that. "Document everything you just told me, dates, specifics, incident numbers. Don't say why. Just keep a record." "Already started," he said. She smiled. "I know, that's why I called you." Sandra called on a Thursday afternoon to say the legal brief was ready. "It's solid," she said. "I'm not going to promise any particular outcome because I never do, but the evidence is clear and the argument is coherent. If you can get the shareholders in the room and present this effectively, I believe you have a genuine chance of stopping the transaction." "And Reynolds?" Separately. "Yes. The undisclosed employment agreement is the kind of thing boards take very seriously when they're presented with it properly, which we will." "Good," Carolyn said. "Let's call the meeting." The formal notice went out on a Monday morning, the kind of official, legally required communication that travels through attorneys and registered agents and arrives in inboxes and mailboxes without any of the warmth of a personal call. She imagined Mark Reynolds receiving it. She imagined the moment he saw her name. She imagined the specific confusion, the scrambling, the disbelief of a man who had looked at a 64-year-old woman with 35 years of service and a grocery store retirement cake and seen nothing worth worrying about. She felt privately and briefly something that was not quite satisfaction, but was in the same neighborhood. Then she put it aside and went back to work. There were still preparations to make. The special shareholder meeting was held on a Wednesday morning in the conference suite of a downtown hotel that had been booked through Sandra's office, neutral ground deliberately chosen. Not the Hartwell boardroom where the home advantage would belong to Mark, not a small room that would feel cramped and defensive. A professional formal space that communicated the gravity of what was happening. Carolyn arrived 40 minutes early. She was wearing charcoal gray, a suit she had bought years ago for occasions that required the maximum possible projection of authority and competence, the kind of clothes that communicated I have been in important rooms before, and I am entirely comfortable here. Her reading glasses were on her notebook, was open on the table in front of her. Her materials were organized in 3 sets, one for herself, one for Sandra, one as backup. She sat at the head of the table and watched the room fill. They came in quietly mostly. The shareholder representatives, the institutional holders, the attorneys. Some she recognized from her calls. Some she hadn't spoken with. Some she had known professionally for years and was seeing for the first time since her retirement. Several of them looked surprised to see her here. A few nodded with something that might have been respect or acknowledgement, or something more complicated than either. Mark Reynolds arrived 12 minutes before the scheduled start time, flanked by 2 attorneys and by Jenna Cole, who had apparently been retained as a witness or support figure. He walked in with the composed, slightly forward-leaning posture of a man who had been told there was a problem and had decided on the basis of insufficient information that it was a manageable one. He saw Carolyn. He stopped. Not visibly, not in a way that would have been obvious to anyone who wasn't watching carefully. But Carolyn had spent 35 years watching people's faces in difficult moments, and she saw it. The fractional pause, the almost imperceptible recalibration, the moment where the mental model he had been working from cracked slightly along the bottom edge. He recovered quickly. He crossed to the other side of the table and sat down, and his face settled back into its practiced expression of confident authority. "This meeting is for shareholders only," he said, looking at Carolyn. The tone was measured, almost polite, the specific politeness of a man who wants to appear reasonable while asserting dominance. Sandra, seated to Carolyn's left, opened a folder. "Miss Hayes is a beneficial shareholder of record," she said, holding 9.4% of outstanding voting shares through the Ridgeway Capital Partners Fund as documented in this filing. She slid the document across the table. "She has full rights to be present and to participate in this meeting under the company's articles of incorporation and applicable state law." A beat of silence. Mark looked at the document. He looked at Carolyn. Something moved across his face, not quite the full reaction, not yet because he was still processing, still trying to fit what he was seeing into a framework that made sense. It didn't fit. The meeting was called to order. The first 40 minutes were technical, the formalities of shareholder meetings, the reading of notices, the confirmation of quorum. Mark's team presented the Prescott acquisition proposal in the way it had been packaged for this audience, upbeat, forward-looking, emphasizing the premium over the recent trading price, while carefully avoiding any discussion of the independent valuation that sat in Carolyn's folder. It was a polished presentation. She gave them that. The slides were clean, the language was precise, and if you didn't know what you were looking for, it sounded like a straightforward and attractive transaction. When it was her turn, Carolyn stood up. She had done a version of this, stood up in a room and explained something complex to people who had a stake in understanding it correctly hundreds of times in her career. Operations reviews, client presentations, board briefings. The context was different. The stakes were different. The feeling fundamentally was the same. She was good at this. She began with the valuation. The acquisition offer of $47 per share is premised on a financial analysis that we believe materially misrepresents the value of Hartwell's core assets, she said. Specifically, the treatment of long-term client contracts, which represent the company's primary source of recurring revenue and competitive advantage, as expiring liabilities rather than durable assets. She walked through the analysis. Not quickly, not slowly, at the pace of someone who understands that comprehension matters more than velocity. She cited sources. She showed calculations. She compared the Prescott valuation to the independent assessment commissioned by Sandra's firm, which placed the fair value of the company at approximately $61 per share, 30% higher than the offer on the table. She watched the room as she spoke. The institutional holders were taking notes. The family trust representative was leaning forward. Several of the smaller shareholders were nodding, with the deliberate, considered nodding of people who had suspected something was wrong but couldn't have told you exactly what, and who were now watching it be explained with a clarity they hadn't expected. Then she turned to the employment agreement. On March 15th of this year, she said, approximately 12 days after the first formal discussions between Hartwell and Prescott Freight Solutions. The current CEO of this company signed a post-acquisition employment agreement with Prescott, entitling him to significant compensation contingent on the completion of this transaction. She placed the document on the table. This agreement was not disclosed to the board, to legal counsel, or to shareholders at any point during the 8 months of acquisition negotiations. The room changed. It's a specific kind of change, the atmospheric shift that happens when a room full of people simultaneously processes a piece of information that reconfigures their understanding of a situation. Not a sound exactly, more like a subtle collective reorientation. Mark's attorney leaned in and said something quietly in his ear. Mark's face, to his credit, did not break, but his hands resting on the table were very still, in the way that hands become still when someone is expending significant effort to keep them that way. "I want to be very clear," Carolyn said. about what I am and am not alleging. I am alleging that this undisclosed agreement created a material conflict of interest that rendered the CEO incapable of representing shareholder interests in good faith during the acquisition negotiations. I am alleging that the resulting acquisition offer fails to reflect the true value of this company, and I am proposing that this meeting vote to reject the current offer and call for an independent review of both the valuation and the conduct of the acquisition process. She sat down. Sandra beside her was already prepared to speak to the legal dimensions. But before Sandra could begin, something unexpected happened. Gerald Harmon walked in. She hadn't been sure he would come. She had called him 3 weeks ago, carefully not asking him to take a side, but simply letting him know what she had found and what she intended to do. He had listened for a long time and then said in the measured way of a man who had spent 40 years making large decisions, "I'll think about it, Carolyn." He was 71 years old, wearing the same style of blue suit he had worn every day of his working life, and he held a one-time proxy from the founding family trust that represented 21% of total voting shares. He looked at Mark Reynolds across the table. "Sorry I'm late," he said to the room in general. He sat down next to Carolyn. Chim. The debate that followed lasted 2 hours. Mark's team argued. They questioned the independence of the valuation. They challenged the characterization of the employment agreement as undisclosed. They presented counter-arguments and alternative interpretations. Some of it was reasonable, some of it was not. But the weight of the room had shifted. By the time the vote was called, Carolyn had done the math 3 times and believed she knew the result. The question was not whether she had the votes to block the transaction. She was fairly confident she did. The question was by how much. The result was 61% voting against the acquisition as currently structured. The Prescott deal was dead. In the immediate aftermath, while people were still processing, while attorneys were conferring, and representatives were making phone calls, Carolyn turned to look at Mark. He had not moved from his chair. He was sitting very still, and his face had finally settled into something that was less constructed, something raw, something that looked more like the face of a person than the face of a performance. She had not planned to say anything directly to him. She had planned to let the result speak. But he looked at her across the table, and something in that look, the disbelief, the recalculation, the specific expression of a man confronting a consequence he had not taken seriously because he had not taken her seriously, prompted her to speak. "You replaced me in a day," she said. Her voice was quiet, not unkind, simply clear. "But you built nothing in 20 years. He said nothing. She gathered her materials, placed them in her folder, closed it, and stood. Gerald beside her put a hand briefly on her shoulder. They walked out of the room together. The board convened an emergency session 3 days later. Mark Reynolds' resignation was accepted or requested, depending on which account you believed at that meeting. The undisclosed employment agreement was referred to outside counsel for review. The Prescott acquisition was formally withdrawn. At the same meeting, the board voted to commission a full independent review of the company's operational performance and financial position. The kind of honest accounting Carolyn thought that should have happened a year ago. She was not at the meeting, but she received a call from Gerald Harmon that evening. "They want to talk to you, Shab," he said, "about the board." She was standing at her kitchen window looking at the garden she had been neglecting and was planning to properly attend to now that she had time. "I know," she said. "What are you thinking?" She thought about it. She thought about 35 years and a grocery store cake and fresh energy and what it meant to spend your best years building something and then watch it be mismanaged by people who had never built anything. She thought about what she actually wanted. "Tell them I'll call them tomorrow," she said. She hung up. She stood at the window for a while longer. Then she went outside and looked at the garden. The call with the board lasted 45 minutes. Gerald had briefed them on the broader picture on Carolyn's shareholding position, on her role in stopping the acquisition, on the institutional knowledge she represented, and the particular kind of credibility she brought to any conversation about the company's future. By the time she joined the call, the tone was less an interview than a negotiation, and the thing being negotiated was not whether she had value to offer, but what form that value would take. She was direct about what she wanted. "I have no interest in coming back to run operations," she said. That's not what this is about. What I care about is whether this company is managed in a way that reflects its actual value to its clients, its employees, and its shareholders. I want to be in a position to ensure that. A board seat, said the chair. Yes. The role would be, I know what the role is, Kate, she said. I've been watching this board for 20 years. A pause. Then from the chair, something that sounded almost like a laugh. Fair enough. The appointment was confirmed the following week. The operational review began in the second month. Carolyn was not managing it. That was not her role, but she was contributing to it in the way that people contribute to things when they have 35 years of relevant knowledge and the particular perspective of someone who has sat on both sides of the table. The review confirmed most of what she had already known: the routing system failures, the client relationship damage, the budget overruns on the technology restructuring. It also surfaced several things she hadn't known: problems that had developed in the distribution network compliance issues, and two of the regional hubs, a staffing situation in Atlanta that had been quietly deteriorating for months. None of it was unfixable. Some of it was going to require significant work. But the company's core assets, the carrier relationships, the client base, the operational infrastructure that she had spent decades helping to build were still there. Damaged in places, strained in others, but there. The company had been undervalued not because it had actually declined, but because the people making decisions about its value had chosen to present it as declining. There was a difference, and the difference was recoverable. Kevin Marsh, as it happened, did not survive the review. His departure was handled professionally, a quiet separation with appropriate severance, no drama, no public statement beyond the standard language about the company, thanking him for his contributions. Carolyn did not attend the meeting where his termination was discussed. She did not need to. She heard through the grapevine that he had already posted on LinkedIn about his exciting new opportunity in operations leadership. She wished him no particular harm. Youth and confidence and insufficient experience were not crimes. They were simply things that in a position of consequence had costs. Jenna Cole remained technically, but the role of HR director was restructured, the reporting relationship changed, and the particular combination of authority and unaccountability that had enabled the forced retirement conversation, and others like it she had learned because Carolyn had not been the only one, was gone. Mark Reynolds retained his attorneys and said little publicly. The formal investigation into the undisclosed employment agreement was ongoing. She did not think about him often. The thing she thought about most in those first months was the program. It had started as a fairly simple idea, an outreach effort for employees over 55 who were facing career transitions, offering mentorship, skills development, and support, navigating what came next. The kind of program that companies occasionally gesture at, but rarely invest in, because the people who need it are generally not the ones making the budget decisions. She wanted to do it properly. She worked with HR, the new HR, with the new leadership to design a framework. She called people she knew at other companies who had built similar programs. She reached out to universities and professional organizations. She spent an afternoon with Patricia, her old financial advisor friend, talking through what the real financial vulnerabilities were for women in their late 50s and 60s navigating career disruption. The program launched in her 4th month on the board. They called it second stage, not second career as she had originally thought, because that implied the first career was over and she no longer believed in framing things as endings. The first cohort had 23 participants. Most of them were women. Most of them had more experience and institutional knowledge than several of the people currently supervising them. Most of them had at some point in the recent past been made to feel like liabilities rather than assets. She met with each of them individually. In those conversations, she did not talk about her own experience directly. She did not tell the story of the retirement party or the grocery store cake or the shareholder meeting. She talked about what she had seen over 35 years, about what she believed about the relationship between experience and value, about the specific and learnable skills of making your expertise legible to people who weren't looking for it. She told them what she wished someone had told her. She told them that their knowledge was real, that their years of work were real, and that the question of whether the institution you happened to be working in chose to recognize that was in fact a question about the institution, not about you. On a Tuesday morning, 6 months after the shareholder meeting, Carolyn walked into the Hartwell building for a board session. The lobby security guard, a man named Robert, who had been working the morning shift for 11 years and who had always greeted her by name, looked up as she came through the door. "Good morning, Ms. Hayes." "Good morning, Robert." She had been back many times since the board appointment, but there was something different about this particular morning, something in the light, or the way the building felt, or simply the specific position of this day in the sequence of all that had happened. She stood for a moment in the lobby looking at the familiar architecture of the place, the slightly too bright overhead lighting, the floor plan she could have navigated in the dark. She heard a voice behind her. It was Daniel, the new hire she had helped with the routing interface on one of her last mornings as an employee. He was still there, still learning, apparently doing reasonably well based on the operations reports. "Ms. Hayes," he said. He looked faintly startled to see her, which was understandable. "You're back." She smiled at him, not the polite smile, not the one that lived in the lower half of the face. "I never left," she said. Nuts. She took the elevator to the executive floor. She had things to do. The board session would cover the Q3 operational review, the new client pipeline, the first cohort outcomes from second stage. She had prepared notes. She had questions she intended to ask. She walked to the conference room window and looked out at the city, the same city she had driven through every morning for 35 years, the same skyline under a different arrangement of clouds. She was 64 years old. She had built things that lasted and seen things fall apart and learned over the length of a career that had bent but not broken, that the difference between the two was usually not luck or talent, but patience and clarity and the willingness to act on what you actually knew. She had known things. She had been patient, and when the moment came, she had acted. She opened her notebook and began reviewing her notes for the session. Around her, the floor was filling with people, the ordinary Tuesday morning business of an institution that was slowly and imperfectly finding its way back to what it was capable of being. Somewhere in the building, a phone rang. She did not look up from her notes. She was working.